In the Vietnam War, few jobs were deadlier than being a door gunner. Strapped to helicopters, they faced death every day. On May 12, 1968, during the Battle of Khe Sanh, a UH-1 Huey was shot down. With fuel leaking and the chopper spinning, the crew had 90 seconds to escape. By the war's end, over 1,000 door gunners were killed, and for the survivors, the battle never really ended. A door gunner was a soldier who sat on the edge of a flying helicopter, right in the doorway, holding a big machine gun. His job was to protect everyone inside the helicopter by watching for enemies and firing at anything that looked dangerous. It could be enemy soldiers hiding in the jungle, someone shooting from the trees, or even a hidden bunker on the ground. The door gunner had to react fast, sometimes in just a few seconds, because the enemy didn't wait. Most door gunners used the M60 machine gun. It was a strong weapon that fired about 500 to 650 rounds every minute. The gun was loud, heavy, and got very hot after just a few seconds of firing. Sometimes the gunners had to change barrels in the middle of the fight because the gun would start to melt from the heat. They also had to carry lots of ammo, belts of bullets hanging around their necks or stacked in boxes next to them. The helicopters they flew in were mostly UH-1s, known as Hueys. These choppers were used for dropping off troops, picking up the wounded, bringing supplies like food and ammo, and even flying into combat zones. The Huey became the symbol of the Vietnam War. More than 7,000 of them were used during the conflict. Every time one flew, a door gunner was sitting there with his weapon, scanning the trees, rivers, and rice paddies for any sign of trouble. The Vietnam War didn't start overnight. The U.S. had been helping South Vietnam for years before sending combat troops. But everything changed in March 1965. That's when the United States officially sent in the first group of combat soldiers, about 3,500 Marines. And after that, things moved fast. By the end of '65, there were already around 184,000 American troops in Vietnam. Just 1 year later, in 1966, that number jumped to over 385,000. As the war grew, the U.S. military started using helicopters more than ever before. Helicopters had one big advantage. They could go places regular trucks or tanks couldn't. They could fly over rivers, thick jungles, and muddy rice fields. They could land in small clearings or even hover above the ground to drop off or pick up troops. But there was a huge problem. Helicopters were easy targets. Enemy fighters, especially the Viet Cong, quickly figured this out. They started aiming at choppers with machine guns, rifles, and even rocket-propelled grenades. Helicopters flew low and slow, which made them perfect targets from the ground. Some didn't even make it to their landing zone before being hit. At first, pilots and crews tried to defend themselves by using their personal rifles or pistols, but that wasn't enough. The military had to do something fast, so they started putting machine gunners on the helicopters. These were the first door gunners. Over time, the military saw how important this role really was. Helicopters with door gunners had a better chance of surviving. They could lay down suppressing fire, scare off attackers, and protect the pilots and passengers. So by 1966, the Army began assigning trained gunners to helicopter units. It became a real position with responsibilities, and some soldiers did it for their entire tour in Vietnam. By the late 1960s, most combat helicopters had at least 2 door gunners, one on each side. The gunners didn't just fire randomly. They had to be smart about it. Firing at the wrong time could give away their position or waste ammo. Firing at civilians or friendly troops could cause disaster. So they had to stay sharp, even when they were scared or tired. Most of the door gunners in the Vietnam War were just kids. They were usually between 18 and 22 years old. Some were fresh out of high school. A few were even younger, lying about their age to join the military. These young guys were sent thousands of miles away from home to fight a war they didn't always understand. They had no idea what they were walking into. Now, a lot of them had never even been on a helicopter before. Suddenly, they were riding in one almost every day. At first, some were just mechanics, radio operators, or even clerks. They fixed things, handled paperwork, or helped load gear. But when extra protection was needed on a mission, they were told to be the door gunner at the moment. Just like that. No special training. No warning. Some guys volunteered for it, thinking it might be better than marching through the jungle with the infantry. They thought maybe being in the air would be safer than being on the ground where landmines and ambushes were common. Helicopters were easy targets. Enemies waited for them with rifles, machine guns, and RPGs. Sometimes they even used traps and bait to lure the helicopters in. Once the chopper came close, all hell would break loose. The door gunners were sometimes called 50 mission gunners, but that was just a nickname. There was no real 50 mission limit. It was like pilots in World War II who went home after a certain number of flights. In Vietnam, you flew until your tour was over, usually 12 months, or until you were wounded, killed, or medically evacuated. Some guys flew hundreds of missions, day and night, rain or shine. Every single flight felt like it could be their last. Some helicopters took off and were shot down minutes later. Others made it back, full of bullet holes. Some never came back at all. Door gunners had to accept that truth early on. They lived with that fear every time they climbed aboard, but they still did it, again and again. For them, the sky was their battlefield. They flew missions almost every day, sometimes even 2 or 3 times a day, with barely any rest in between. These missions could happen in the early morning, during the hottest part of the day, or in the middle of the night. The missions never stopped, and neither did the danger. Every time they lifted off the ground, they had to be on full alert. The enemy could attack from anywhere. Sometimes the Viet Cong would lie perfectly still and silent until a helicopter flew close, and then they'd open fire without warning. To try and stay safe, door gunners wore steel helmets and flak vests, which were supposed to protect their chest and back. But these didn't always work. They weren't designed to stop high-powered bullets or RPG blasts. Many gunners were hit in the arms, legs, or even in the face. There were even stories of gunners being blown right out of the helicopter during an explosion. And then there was the noise. Now, the helicopter itself was already loud. Add to that the roar of the M60 machine gun, which could shoot up to 650 rounds a minute, and it became nearly impossible to hear anything. The gunner was also firing just inches from his own ears, with bullets flying out, shell casings raining down, and smoke rising from the overheating barrel. Because of all this noise, talking wasn't easy. Even with headsets, it was hard to hear clearly. And sometimes the gear, well, didn't work right, or the situation was too loud to communicate. That's why many door gunners used hand signals, or just shouted at the top of their lungs. Some developed their own quick ways to point out targets or signal trouble. During a mission, a door gunner had to watch, shoot, reload, and hold on, all at the same time. And reloading wasn't easy. They often had to feed new belts of bullets into the gun while hanging out the open door, balancing against the wind, sudden movements, and incoming fire. One wrong move, they could fall out. Many helicopters didn't make it back from their missions. From 1965 to 1975, the U.S. military lost over 5,000 helicopters in Vietnam. That means on average, 2 helicopters were destroyed every single day for 10 years straight. Most were hit by enemy fire. Some went down due to engine problems or bad weather. But no matter the cause, the result was usually the same: crashes, fires, injuries, and death. If the helicopter crashed, survival was just the beginning of another nightmare. The jungle was dense, confusing, and full of danger. After a crash, the gunner had seconds to react. The helicopter could catch fire, explode, or be surrounded by enemy soldiers. Gunners had to pull wounded crew members from the wreckage, even while flames burned and bullets flew. In many cases, door gunners stayed behind at the crash site to protect the others. They used their M60 to hold off enemy fighters while medics treated the injured or while pilots tried to call for backup. Some died right there, fighting until the last bullet. Others were seriously injured, but kept shooting to save the crew. Sometimes there wasn't any help coming. Jungle could be too thick, or the fighting too intense. If rescue couldn't reach them fast enough, gunners had to try to escape on foot, carrying injured men or crawling through mud and brush, while still being hunted by enemy soldiers. One of the worst times for helicopter crews came in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. It was a huge surprise attack by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong across South Vietnam. Cities, bases, and even the U.S. Embassy were hit. In just a few days, hundreds of helicopters were sent into hot zones to move troops and supplies. Enemy fighters fired at anything that flew. Some units reported 20 or more helicopters shot down in a single day. The air was thick with gunfire and smoke. Door gunners were pushed to their limit. They fired non-stop, trying to protect their crews. But many were killed mid-flight or during crash landings. Some were burned alive in wrecked choppers. Others survived the crash, only to be captured by the Viet Cong. And being captured often meant torture, imprisonment, or death. There were also many cases where helicopters went down in remote jungles, and no one even knew right away. Gunners and other crew members were left on their own for hours, sometimes days, waiting for help, bleeding, scared, and completely surrounded. Even if they survived, the trauma didn't leave them. They witnessed horrific scenes that they could not unsee. Many developed PTSD. Some started drinking heavily. Others took drugs to numb the pain. The military didn't offer much support back then. It wasn't just the violence, the constant stress, the never-ending danger, and the feeling of being hunted from the air. It all piled up. Some gunners would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Others couldn't sleep at all. One former gunner once said that every time he heard a loud bang, he thought he was back in Vietnam. That feeling never really went away for many of them. Out of the 58,220 U.S. soldiers who died in Vietnam, a large number were involved in helicopter missions. Exact numbers for door gunners are hard to find, but estimates suggest that hundreds died doing this role. Thousands more were wounded. Even those who came back didn't always survive for long. Society didn't welcome Vietnam veterans with open arms. Many were ignored, or even blamed for the war. Despite the danger, many door gunners showed incredible bravery. They saved lives. They fought back against ambushes. There are many stories of gunners who kept firing even after being shot themselves. Guys like Specialist 4th Class Dwight H. Johnson showed just how much courage it took to survive in Vietnam. Johnson wasn't a door gunner himself. He was a tank driver. But his story fit the same kind of life and death chaos that door gunners faced every day. In January 1968, during a battle near Dak To, Johnson's tank was disabled. Instead of staying safe, he jumped out, grabbed a rifle, and ran into enemy fire to save his fellow soldiers. When he ran out of bullets, he picked up a fallen soldier's weapon and kept fighting. Even after being wounded, he refused to give up. For his unbelievable bravery, Johnson was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military award in the United States. Door gunners had the same kind of courage. Every time they flew, they were right in the middle of it. Many of them were recognized for their bravery too. Some received the Silver Star, the third highest award for valor in the U.S. Army. Others earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, which was given to aircrew members who showed incredible heroism during flight. These medals weren't handed out easily. You had to do something truly extraordinary, like saving your crew under heavy fire, taking out enemy positions while being shot at, or keeping your helicopter flying while everyone else was dead or wounded. Many of these heroes didn't live to receive their medals. Their awards were given to their families after they were killed in action. Others came home carrying both their medals and deep emotional scars. The Vietnam War was called the Helicopter War for a reason, because no other war had ever used helicopters like this before. Helicopters were everywhere. They weren't just for flying soldiers around. They were a lifeline. They brought food, water, ammunition. During the war, the U.S. used over 12,000 helicopters. That's more helicopters than had ever been used in any other war before. By 1973, the U.S. started pulling its combat troops out of Vietnam. The big plan was called Vietnamization. It meant handing the fighting over to the South Vietnamese forces while U.S. soldiers went home. But even though American ground troops were leaving, the helicopters stayed busy. The sky was still deadly, and door gunners kept flying missions. In March 1973, the last official American combat troops left Vietnam. But the fighting didn't stop. North Vietnamese forces kept pushing south. Helicopters were needed to move people and supplies and sometimes help evacuate areas that were under attack. By April 1975, things were at their worst. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, was about to fall. The North Vietnamese army was closing in fast. American civilians, embassy workers, and South Vietnamese allies were desperate to escape. Operation Frequent Wind was launched, the final evacuation. Helicopters became the only way out. They flew non-stop, lifting people off rooftops, embassy grounds, and even parking lots. Even in these last hours, door gunners were still at their posts. They weren't just there for looks. If the crowds got out of control or if enemy soldiers tried to shoot down a helicopter, the door gunners had orders to protect the helicopters at all cost. Many stood watch with their M60s, loaded and ready, scanning the crowd, the streets, and the nearby buildings for any threat. It's hard to imagine that kind of pressure. The door gunners knew it could all go wrong at any second. They had to stay sharp. They had to make split-second decisions. And they had to live with those decisions afterwards. When the last helicopters finally lifted off from Saigon on April 30th, 1975, carrying the last Americans out of Vietnam, it wasn't just pilots who made it happen. It was also the door gunners. Today, not many people talk about the door gunners, but their role was vital. They flew into danger again and again, knowing they might not come back. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built in Washington, D.C. Many names on that wall were helicopter crews, pilots, medics, and door gunners. Some museums now display the M60 machine guns and Huey helicopters. Veterans gather every year to remember the war and the friends they lost.